We're back with lecture number 10 on industrialization and some interesting political theories that will start to pop up by the 19th century. Now, human beings have always manufactured things. Since the Stone Age, they have made their own tools right out of rocks. People have always made things. They used to make their own clothing, their own shoes, what have you, in their homes. So we've always been a manufacturing species, you might say, but this is going to change somewhat in the scale and scope of manufacturing when we reach the 19th century, and even beginning before that in the 18th century. We're going to see the rise of the so-called Industrial Revolution in Western Europe. It will begin in Britain, and it will spread to many other countries, France, Belgium. It will even hop the Atlantic and make its way over to the Americas. Now, there are several important points that I need to make about this Industrial Revolution, how it's different, for example, from the way people used to make things in their homes. It involves the mechanization of production. That's just a big fancy term for now machines are going to be taking the place of what people used to do by hand. And a lot of this new technology will be initially powered by either steam or water. So these big steam-powered or water-powered machines are very large, very expensive pieces of equipment, and they cannot be housed in people's homes. So what we're going to see is a so-called factory system developing in many of these countries as they begin to industrialize. Now, a business owner will buy several pieces of very large, expensive, noisy equipment and will place them in one setting that becomes known as a factory. This changes where people now do their work. People used to make things by hand in their homes. The work came to them, so to speak. Now the opposite is true. Now they leave their homes to go to a factory to work. This will also change how people are paid. In pre-industrial times, you were paid per piece, per shoe that you created, for example, in your own home. Now, though, you go to a factory and a machine can crank out things much faster than you could by hand. Now, you don't get paid by the output because the machine can outperform you in terms of production. Now, you get paid a wage according to how many hours that you spend at this factory. So the introduction of wage labor is also baked into this Industrial Revolution. Now, as for when the Industrial Revolution first begins to take hold, the 18th and 19th centuries is when it starts to really kind of find its stride. And where it begins is England, later what we call Britain, and will spread, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, to Western Europe and then hop the ocean to the Americas as well. But why does it begin in Britain? Well, if you'll take a look at the map that I have here on the slide of the major rivers of England, if you'll recall, we said that many of these earliest machines are water-powered or steam-powered. That means that you need to be close to a water source. So given the ubiquity of rivers that crisscross Britain, it's a no-brainer that you have this power source literally almost everywhere. In addition to that, once a product is created, you need to distribute it. You need to get it to market so that it can be sold. What we'll see is that the government of Britain over time will also make a sustained effort at building railroad lines through their country. This is a newer, faster means of moving both people and goods from point A to point B. You can see the railroad map of Britain by 1854. So having access to good infrastructure, roads, and in particular rail lines will also help to benefit this burgeoning Industrial Revolution. Another reason why Britain is the original home to the Industrial Revolution is that it had lots of raw materials that were being sent back to its country from its many colonial holdings across the globe. Additionally, we will see another factor in Britain becoming the home of the Industrial Revolution has to do with England's growing population and the agricultural revolution that led to greater crop yields there to support a greater population. More people need more jobs. Well, these factories are providing jobs for its growing population. At the same time Britain's population was increasing, though, access to land, free and open access to farmland, was decreasing. So people that normally would be involved in agriculture after the passage of the Enclosure Acts by Parliament in Britain, people that would normally have access to some of these farmlands, all these lands are being enclosed. That's what the term literally means. Free and open access to farmlands are being restricted by the time we get to the 18th and 19th centuries by these acts of Parliament. In short, land was being transformed from public access to private ownership. And what this meant is we're going to see an exodus of former agricultural laborers from the countryside into cities because these people have no means of making a living anymore. They don't have access to land. And so these factories are more than happy to hire them on. So now we've got the labor part of the equation accounted for in Britain. Lots of landless poor flocking to the cities looking for employment, and many of them will find employment to begin with in textile mills. England had long since been involved in spinning yarn and weaving fabric, producing clothing from wool as well as linen and cotton. And the pre-industrial system of producing thread or fabric took place in people's homes, as we said earlier. This cottage industry, or the putting out system, is the name for the pre-industrial means of production in which people produce things in their cottages, in their homes. The work was put out to them. This will change, though, with the introduction of a lot of new advanced machinery that will now speed up again what people used to do by hand. New advances such as spinning looms and water frames to help with the weaving of fabric are going to dramatically speed up the process of textile production. And these huge machines are now located in factories, typically in city areas. Now, better power sources for these massive machines are necessary for this process to continue growing. Pressurized steam, for instance, creates much more energy than running water from a river, for example. So there were already early versions of steam engines, but they were rather inefficient and not very powerful. That is, until Scotsman and inventor James Watt began experimenting and creating better versions of steam engines. Watt experimented for a number of years on existing designs and eventually produced a rotary motion steam engine, which now drove on both the forward and backward strokes of the piston. Watt's new steam engine design was much more powerful. It could even be used to run railroad engines, dramatically speeding up travel times, for instance. Other inventors, such as Richard Arkwright, was quick to see the importance of this new invention, and he began adapting Watt's steam engine design in his textile mills. Britain not only took the early lead in textile production, but also in iron production as well. And there were many discoveries that went along with this process. For example, in 1710, Abram Darby discovered that you could use coal to bake out the impurities in iron instead of charcoal, resulting in a better quality of iron. By 1850, Britain was producing more iron than the rest of the world. This resulted in improved construction materials for buildings, bridges, even ships. And by the late 19th century, the Bessemer process was created, turning iron into steel, which was an even more superior and durable building material. So before long, steam-powered locomotive engines were springing up around the English countryside, carrying people and goods from one place to another. Factory owners could now build large-scale production facilities, bringing entire factory processes under one roof. And we're going to see that England will very rapidly take the lead in industrialization. As you can see, they begin to far outstrip other European countries and the United States during the 19th century in their industrial output. For instance, whatever the product, by 1860, 2% of the world's population in Britain were producing 1/2 of the world's stores of iron, cotton, textiles, and coal. While many industrialists were making quite a tidy profit off of these new factories that they're building, we should take a moment to understand the darker side of industrialization. At the top tier, with money being the great equalizer, some of these new industrialists came to replace aristocrats or nobles as their main force in society. You also have a rising middle class in these industrializing countries. You need professionals such as commercial professionals, patent lawyers, merchants, small business owners, and the like, middle managers. You've got to have logistics managers, shipping clerks to keep up with the prodigious output of many of these factories during the period. Despite this growth in the middle and upper class, however, many people in Europe undergoing this industrial revolution were still agricultural laborers or unskilled workers. Times were particularly tough for workers who suffered from low wages and poor living conditions, not to mention the copious amounts of industrial waste that will be belched out into the atmosphere or dumped freely into drinking water sources and rivers. There were many dangerous professions during this period. Coal miners routinely lost their lives from cave-ins, collapses, flooding of certain mine shafts would simply kill large numbers of them, or they might die more slowly over time from black lung disease. They were not wearing respirators during this period, so some of them would simply, that coal dust would accumulate in their lungs over time. Children were used in factories often during this period. I had on the prior slide, for example, pictures of children working in a textile mill. You can see all the many moving parts in these machines. It would be very easy for not only a child but an adult to get their clothing ensnared in one of these parts and be maimed or seriously injured. The living conditions that many people endured in these overcrowded, squalid areas, working class neighborhoods of many municipal areas, this also compromised people's mortality. We'll also see some critics coming from the working class, not just of their poor pay and dangerous working conditions and living conditions, but we'll see some criticizing the loss of their livelihoods. In the textile industry in particular, we'll see a group that become known as the Luddites. These were a group of weavers from the English Midlands who attacked and destroyed looms and other new machines in an effort to preserve their livelihoods. These Luddites thought that if they destroyed some of this newer manufacturing equipment that was taking their jobs, that they would be able to return to a simpler time when they were the boss of themselves and they worked from home and they had control. Of course, this was not the answer, and many of them were rounded up and arrested. Some of them were executed even by the English government. Other critics began to emerge during the Industrial Revolution, such as the German political philosopher Karl Marx. Marx traveled and lived extensively in a number of different towns, from Berlin to Paris to Brussels and later London, and he witnessed firsthand the horrid living and working conditions of many unskilled laborers. This had a profound effect upon him, and he will develop the idea over time that all societies pass through certain phases of class struggles, that ultimately the epic battle would be between an ownership class, which controls production, and a lower class, which produces the profit for the ownership class. He believed the current capitalist system was highly exploitative to workers. And indeed, he considered capitalism to be nothing more than, quote, a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, whereby the owner of a business controlled the economic, political, and social landscape at the expense of their workers. His most famous work will be the Communist Manifesto, which will be published in 1848. And he will argue that after this epic revolution of the workers in their own defense, that a stateless, classless society would develop known as communism. These ideas will spread rapidly, especially among the working class throughout Europe, and socialist workers' parties will begin organizing across the continent, sometimes running candidates for political office, advocating for reform, better wages, and better working conditions. Yet there were those that defended industrialization and capitalism. These became known as classical liberals. Classical liberalism is a philosophy committed to the idea of limited government, to protect the individual's liberties, including the freedom of religion, speech, press, assembly, and the like. And more importantly, that a government that kind of minds its own business would also be a government that would not intervene in the economy. To classical liberals, the highest good was competition in a free market economy. Adam Smith's influence can be seen here. They believe that a free market economy leads to prosperity for all.